Well, hi there. This is Mobile Learning Mindsets. My name is Carl Hooker, and a lot of I thank you for those of you that have joined the meeting. We'll be doing some stuff kind of in the chat a little bit too as we're kind of going through this. I see a couple of you are in the meeting right now, and I'll try to keep monitor on that chat. I do have some polls and things like that, but since there's only a few of us, we'll just go ahead and use the chat feature for as much of this as we can. So I'm going to go ahead and use that in just a second. Just a few things real quick, some housekeeping items. Of course, all of these are part of the Global Education Technology Academy, the GETA, as they say. So you can find all of this talk and many others on YouTube as well. And just a little bit about this background of this chat, this talk. Actually, this is a talk that I've been giving for several years about mobile learning. And it's interesting now to see what's happened because of everything with COVID, of course, and schools having to shift to remote. A lot of the things that I said during these talks over the last several years really apply to what's happening at this very moment. And it's also part of a series of books that I wrote called Mobile Learning Mindset, if you want to check those out through ISTE. But I think it's a timely topic, and as we kind of go through this, you'll notice that there's some things that I say that we're like, well, of course that makes sense now, but when I said them originally, it's people are like, what do you mean you have to have flexible schedules? What do you mean you have to have asynchronous and synchronous learning, and what does that even mean? So it'll be interesting to see as we go through this. So go ahead and drop in the chat, and again, we won't go through we won't use the polls for this because there's only a couple of you in there, and I don't want to spend all the time going through polls if there's only a couple folks. It's a good tool to use for like large crowds, but in this case, just tell us where you're from today. So go ahead and I see a couple of you have signed into the chat there. Go ahead and just tell us where you're from, and we'll look at that as well as we kind of go through this. So I'd like to see who's joined us. I see we have Yasuhiko who's joined us, and also Jason has joined us, and then Mr. H, which I think is my other device. There you go. So tell us where you're from. Oh, Wichita, Kansas. High school science. Yes, I've been to Wichita. In fact, I may have met you, Jason, at Wichita. Not too long ago. That was right before all this happened, doing some work over there. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about this, a little bit my credentials, just for those of you that don't know. And hi there, Yashi from La Jolla, California as well. A little bit of my credentials for those of you guys that don't know me. I've been in education for a long time now. Did a couple of different one-to-one programs prior to all of this, and then classroom teacher as well, educational consultant. I've done a lot with Future Ready Schools, especially lately. We've been doing a lot. We're really trying to help get schools prepared for what's coming up this fall. Some of you may have already started school or getting ready to gear up for that, and just as much content as we can put out. And it's a great free program. If you ever have a chance to check it out, check out Future Ready Schools. Great organization I'm proud to be a part of. So other things I always like to share kind of a little bit of my origin story really quick before we get too deep into this. This was me as I used to teach first grade. If you can't see me, I'm right there. And we'll come back to these kids in a little bit, but it's interesting to think about when you think about mobile learning and what it looked like in a classroom environment back then. It was very different. You'll see a picture of it in just a second versus today. This is me teaching about 700 freshmen pre-COVID, obviously, because they're all no social distancing, no masks going on here. And you want to talk about mobile learning, a lot of the things and activities I did with these kiddos involved their phones. And so flashing forward just a few years after I was a teacher to go into this now change and just how everything's kind of changed and evolved. This picture actually here, I've asked them all a question like, how many of you are on Snapchat? And you see how many hands have gone up. And if I asked them TikTok, they'd probably say the same thing, right? So just getting familiar with them and how they're learning and where they're going. And we'll talk more about that as we kind of get through it. But how does that affect the way you teach as a teacher too? I think that's an important thing to think about when you think about mobility. I've heard a lot the last couple of weeks about, well, kids are going to have to sit all day on a Zoom call because of remote learning. And I'm like, that's a big assumption saying that kids just have to sit. You don't have to sit. You can actually stand up. When our kids, we put some books on a shelf and had them set their little device on top of that. There's no reason to believe that you have to sit through it all the time. And I think sometimes we do that as teachers. We just assume, okay, you got to stay in your seat. But now that they're remote, they can kind of do it anywhere, outside or inside. And I'll tell you a couple stories of some teachers that are doing some inventive stuff around that too as well. So in the chat, we'll go into the chat, skip the poll. What is your first memory of technology when you were in school? So think back to when you first were in school, maybe as a student, maybe as a teacher, and you started using technology for learning, let's say, some sort of learning technology. So drop into the chat there. Tell me what your first recollections are, and I'll give you a couple of mine as well. First memories. Word documents. Yeah, I think, Jason, I was using, it wasn't Word, it might have been ClarisWorks or Apple worked or something. Like it was a program way before, and I think Word was like Word 3.1, a little different programming back then. But yeah, using some sort of word processing tool. Word Perfect was another one. Use a Unix machine. Oh, when you're a graduate student, Yashi, that's good. Yeah, so you get right into it right off the bat. You guys are way ahead of where I was. I remember doing it was called Mario Types, and it was the Mario Brothers game in the 1980s. It was really big, of course, on Nintendo. And somebody had made a typing game out of it that our typing teacher used in middle school. And it was so cool because you could type, we hit the letters, you'd hit the little mushrooms and jump around and stuff. So he gamified learning for me, which was kind of a neat idea. And then it's funny because depending on what schools you're at, some schools had access to that technology. But later, when I went to a Texas school, I was in Michigan at the time, I moved to Texas. They didn't have anything like it. So typing was on an electric typewriter. So I kind of went backwards a little bit and I was like, hey, how do I type on this thing? Where's the little games with the jumping mushroom guy? Um, this is a picture I've shared quite a bit in some of my other talks too, but this is kind of what my classroom looked like when I was teaching fifth grade. Again, not very mobile. And these kids played lots of different games, and the ones I like to point out always, of course, Oregon Trail, you've died of dysentery, of course, and where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? Again, their first recollections of what technology looks like when they were getting into school too, because these were kids that didn't have access to a lot of computers at the time, especially in the area of town where I was teaching. And so for them, having that little bit of interaction, that little bit of interaction with those devices was a big thing, even if it was very consumptive, meaning that I was just having the kids kind of plug in and be a part of it. And then this is another picture I always like to share. This is my family not too long ago. And this is really us. This is us about, we were actually driving to California. So Yashi, who's joined us from La Jolla, we were actually headed to La Jolla on this trip. That's funny that you're on the chat. And so we all load up, get ready to get in this car. Like we're going to take mobile learning on the road, figure out what's going on. Notice we're all smiling. This is about 1 minute before we get in that car, because exactly 2 minutes after we get in the car, this is what happens. When are we going to be there, Dad? I'm like, it's going to take us 10 days. Just give us a break. You'll be there when we get there. So no, the reason I show this picture is also because these are the years these kids graduate from high school, and how much of their world has become mobile. We'll talk a little bit about that as well, but I mean, things that have changed quite a bit over time, just even in the last decade, when you talk about mobility and how that, and now, of course, remote learning, and what does that look like? So, could you, in theory, go to school while also doing a road trip? I mean, there's some thoughts around that. And again, I'll share a story that I've heard recently of a teacher friend of mine who's doing that very thing. But again, showing this picture, just kind of giving you the idea of the dates, and then also looking at these photos, which I've shared before too. This is a French artist and his interpretation in 1899 of what he predicted school would look like. So in the chat there, just give me some feedback. What are some things you notice about this photo? Things you're seeing that just kind of picking out there about what's happening in this classroom of the quote unquote future, right? These kids, of course, are tethered to their desks there. I see we have someone else has joined us to join the conversation. Go ahead. Yeah, just check in on the chat there, and we're using the chat kind of as an interactive tool as well as I do this talk. This talk is being recorded. And just kind of looking at, some classes still sit that way, Jason says. That's true. These kids aren't very socially distant. However, it wouldn't be that hard because it looks like there's only 6 or 7 of them in the classroom, so you could just spread them out. Yeah, a lot of them are still like, let's all face the front, even though the professor, so to speak, he's over there grinding books quickly into this machine. Yeah, the big difference, the guy Jason says into the chat, not wireless yet, right? These guys are still hardwired. So maybe not that futuristic. Now we could just go completely wireless. We just put in our earbuds and then kind of plug into the kids' brains. Also, of course, they're not very mobile. Obviously, they're all sitting very astutely with their feet kind of on their little bars there, hands folded passively as they sit and listen. You could probably make some other assumptions based on the makeup of the actual students. If you look at the students, you may notice some things. Many online classes are doing this exact thing. Yeah, that's true, Yashi. A lot of them were doing this spring. It was when the triage moment happened, I like to call it the educational triage. It was like, let's quickly figure out ways just to digitize some books / worksheets and put them in the minds of our kids. And there's something to be said that there is time, as much as we talk about consumption isn't great all the time. You don't want to have completely consumption of content. We'll talk about that in a second. You want to make sure there's opportunities to create as well. And these kids obviously didn't have it in their classroom. It's a little bit different. And if you look at my classroom too, I mean, to be a self-critic here, I was doing very much the same thing, right? They are tethered, they're wired into their headphones, and they're watching these kind of these little tutorial video games that they could play like I did when I was a kid. And again, that's a start, and there's a place and a time for all of that. But also, one thing I feel like I failed with these fifth graders was that I didn't give them the opportunity to create as much. And so how do we think about those opportunities too going forward, even in a remote learning environment or a blended environment, which is what this talk is really geared about. So again, I could take this picture and superimpose the students of Westlake High School where I was when we rolled out our one-to-one program, and you'll notice very similar, by the way. Notice the desks still in rows, kids passively sitting. Now they have their devices instead of that. And to be honest, very much the same conversations, just like you mentioned, Yashi, in the spring. Same things happened when we first handed out our devices. It was, hey, can we get our textbook on this device? And I'm like, yeah, you can get your textbook on this device, but if that's all you're going to use it for, then it's a really expensive e-reader, right? So I think that we go to that just as a teachers in general because that's our go-to. Like we know textbooks, we know worksheets; those are like the standard tools of teaching from the 20th century. But heading into this century, we need to kind of convert that into how can we continue to use these adaptable tools, make them more mobile. These kids here sitting in a classroom all day in the same seats, while they have these beautiful mobile devices, they can go anywhere and sit anywhere. But yet we still kind of put them in those places. So it's kind of interesting to think about that. This is a chart that was shared with me. Tracy Clark, you can see her there at the bottom at Tracy Clark 08. This is her soft skills bingo card. And I love this. I've always shared this at talks over the past because I think what it is it's a culmination of research that she had done where she had kind of looked at what Fortune 500 CEOs were asking for in terms of the traits that they wanted their students to have, their students or incoming employees, I should say, have when they come into the workforce. And so you see a lot of things on here that don't include anything about academia, although you could say that academics could be embedded in many of these tools. You probably also recognize that there are the 4 C's there: creativity, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, all of which can be embedded in any subject area. So I don't care what you teach, if you're a librarian, if you're teaching music class, there's so many different ways that you can embed a lot of these tools and triggers into a classroom without having to have that quote unquote curriculum. Because even though I don't see math and science on here or reading, you could say that math and science are definitely a part of critical thinking. Reading and communication is huge. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of tie that in. And I'm going to focus some of this on communication because I feel like this is the new thing as we move forward, as we start to try to figure out how do we bridge the connection between ourselves and our students remotely or even in a blended environment. What does that look like in terms of communication? And communication has gone through a lot over the years. It's I always like this Clay Shirky quote. It says, when we change the way we communicate, we change society, which is true. And we have changed the way we communicate. And this has affected us quite a lot in education. So like when we started, I remember I'll bring up this lady first of all. She's my aunt Gloria, and this is us after my birthday here in Texas. Must have been about 2.5 years ago, and we went out for dinner, went out for lunch, and all this, and she was telling stories about how she worked for what they said quote unquote Ma Bell. I don't know if you know what that is, but basically it was the telephone company. She started working there in 1948, and she worked there for 50 years. 50 years. Think about that. Think about how much time has changed in her industry. By the time she was retiring at 72, she was climbing up wireless cell phone towers and installing the technology up in those. So quite a change from like this phone, which is what it was like when she started, where they actually had to hang up the phone to actually hang it up, versus, as we kind of evolved through the future, we had these, of course, the rotary dials, which are still out there, and some kids can't figure out how to use them. I've seen videos out there of kids that don't even know how to use these things now. It's fun to watch. And then also makes me feel old. But then, of course, transitioning to this, but you're still tethered. Communication can happen quicker because you can push those buttons, but you're still tethered. And if you wanted to have a private conversation, of course, it meant you had to go like in the other room with a really long cord and close the door. So, then there was the cordless telephone, which was great, but you couldn't leave the house. Now you're untethered somewhat, and you can still communicate quickly with those little push buttons there and via talk and speakerphone, which is a new kind of addition there. So a little different ways to communicate. And then, of course, this, which lets you leave the house all of a sudden, this big brick phone, otherwise probably familiarly known, especially in California, as the Zach Morris phone. And this phone was great, except that, it had this, I had a friend who had one of these, and it was like, you could only charge, it was like $6 a minute or something. So he would be on it all the time. And like, what are you doing? Who are you talking to? He's like, nobody, I can't afford the call. He would just use that as like a fake prop. And then you have, of course, this one, which was my first cell phone. And I don't know if those of you that are watching in the chat, what your first cell phone was, but this one was, at the time, it was pretty revolutionary, even though it looks like a giant walkie-talkie. By the way, I still have it. It's here in my office. It's a giant walkie-talkie, but what was revolutionary about it was what? Now, in the chat, tell me what was something that this phone could do in terms of communication that all the previous cell phones before it couldn't do. So all the technology I talked about before, the big bag phone Jason said he had, that's great. The big bag phone and the brick phone and all those were great for talking, but this one could let you do something else that no other phone could do. And it wasn't just playing Snake, which I think someone always says, "Oh, you can play that little game Snake." It was like the first one you could get games on, which is true. You could do that. This is actually the first phone that you could text with. And so if you think about texting, this is one of the first phones that allowed you to text. And all of a sudden it changes communication because instead of using this as just a talking device, now all of a sudden if I wanted to say the word hello, I could just type in 44335556666 and that equals hello. Easy enough, right? It only took however many digits that is to actually get the word hello written. But, kids today, they don't realize how easy they have it with their texting because now you can just do voice to text. But again, it transformed communication in a lot of ways. And then going to the next step of that is the phone that when I saw it come on the market, I was like, this is it. This was my phone. This is like, I told my wife it's 2004. I'm like, this is the last phone I'll ever own, honey. I promise. I knew it's $350, but it's amazing. Do you remember the Razor? I mean, this thing was just high quality. It was beautiful, slick design, the metal. It looked like a weapon at the same time. Now, what was interesting about this phone was that not only could you text on it and you could play some of the games, but it also added another feature that was pretty powerful when you think about education and communication. And it's that little window up on the top above the logo there, and it was a little camera. And all of a sudden you had this little phone that you take pictures with, and that started changing again, education. And I said, this is it, hon. This is the last phone I'll ever own. I promise. Well, then smartphones came out and everything kind of changed. So again, thinking about that and what that effect is to our students, just in terms of that evolution of communication, thinking about my oldest daughter, who was, for lack of a better word, invented in 2008, and she's now going into sixth grade. And this device was invented in 2007. So anybody who's a sixth grader, seventh grader, I'd even say eighth grade or ninth grade, probably has not ever remembered a world where some sort of mobile smartphone didn't exist, because that's just part of their everyday life. Now, that's for them, that's important. For us, we're like, this is still kind of a game-changing / distraction tool, depending on which side you fall on that. And sometimes it's both, right? So when you think about what Douglas Adams says, I always like this quote when he talks about what technology is for those kids born prior to that time. Any kid that you teach that's really middle school or below, that's normal. It's just part of the way the world is. It's part of the way the world works. If you teach kids that are even younger than that, like 5 and 6 year olds and younger, I would say that they're very familiar with smartwatches and like having Echo Dots and things like that are just common. Having a smart house is common to them. It's not unusual. For us, it's game changing in a lot of ways, right? Oh, I can change my thermostat with my phone. That's really cool. But the kids are like, yeah, we're used to that. And then you got this next group, right? That is anything that's invented between the ages of 15 and 35 is new and exciting. And it's revolutionary, and you can probably get a career in it, right? The App Store and Steam and robotics and artificial intelligence and all of this great, exciting stuff that we could probably get careers in. That's that kind of millennial group. Now there's my group, which is more my age, which is anything invented after the age of 35 is against the natural order of things. It's just evil and should go away. Not everything, but and I'm a pretty high-tech dad, but lately I've been sitting here, of course, been on quarantine like everybody else, and been watching my kids watch a lot of YouTube videos of other kids playing Minecraft, which still to me does not make any sense. Like, why don't you just play Minecraft? And, no, we want to watch this. Anyway, or I see a lot of kids learning how to dance from different video games, right? That's the new thing now. We're going to make a TikTok video based on a Fortnite dance. Lots of different ways to do that. So go back, instead of the poll, again, go into the chat. We'll do this in the chat. What's one thing, I was thinking about my own kids, like things that they were born after the 21st century. So what are some things you think kids born this century will never get to experience that we got to experience as kids? I say we because I'm of a different generation. I'm Gen X or whatever. I grew up in the 80s. So think about some things and drop those into the chat. What are some things that kids born this century will never get the chance to experience? And that could be good or bad. We'll see what you guys come up with. Yeah, the portable typewriter, Yashi says. Yeah, we used to have those little they were like they were e-netbooks or something. There were these little green like portable word processing things where you could type 5 or 6 lines in it and then you could connect it and print it if you wanted to. I can't remember the name of it. It's like a little clamshell looking thing. What else? What are some other things? I always joke that my kids will never get to experience Blockbuster the same way, right? Because they have everything on demand. They didn't have to drive 6 miles to go see if they actually had their tape there and then go through the tape deck and figure out if it was still, in the return bin or whatever. That's another thing I feel like kids these days don't get to experience. What else? What are some other things in the chat there? I see Jason's in there, academic managers in there. Rotary phones for sure. And I wish I had that video to share with you guys. It's in if you Google search it, it came out about a year ago. It was a couple of kids in Dallas, I think, that were like they're 17, and their parents basically just recorded them trying to figure out, all right, pick up the phone and figure out how to dial it. Oh yeah, floppy disks. This is crazy. I was doing a talk with some fifth graders the other day prior to COVID, and I was walking around and I held up a phone booth. Yeah, that's a good one too. I held up a floppy disk and I said, anyone know what this is? And all the kids like start raising their hand and they're guessing what, like, oh, it's a, it's like it's a weird sort of like a Rolodex thing. And I was like, well, you don't even know what a Rolodex is. But then one kid said, yeah, it was a 3-inch. It wasn't the 5. One kid said, is it a 3D printed Microsoft Word save icon? And I said, it does kind of look like that, doesn't it? I was like, I don't know why someone would want to do that. So it's funny how they now know what a floppy disk is because of the save button. CD and DVD players. Yeah, I think we're getting there. My kids are so used to on demand. We still have DVD players, and I think I have a CD player somewhere in my house, but I don't know where those are. Video cassettes, we busted one out. We had our anniversary, 17th anniversary a couple of months ago, and we decided to bust out the video cassette. And even I'm like, ooh, the quality on those things is just not that good. I got to digitize this thing quick before it deteriorates. Yeah, those are just some other things. Great ideas coming into the chat here. Yeah. Oh, the beta. Yes. Oh, I might show one of those in a minute. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So yeah, good ideas dropping in the chat there. Thinking about that, different things that kids won't get to experience. And then when we think about that Shirky quote again about how communication changes our life and our lifestyle. I mean, this is actually from a mall in Utah that decided to put in texting, walking, and running lanes, which I think, in school buildings, especially those of you that teach middle school and high school, is probably a necessary thing. Because I don't know if you've ever been like walking behind a texter or driving behind one, but they kind of aren't always paying attention to what they're doing. So that does affect, again, communication affects us. And I was at a recent event. This is, again, pre-COVID, obviously, as you can tell, because everyone's crowded around each other at tables. And I realize how much I miss this now. Sitting there at a dinner table, and this is at a mobile conference. And we were just talking about mobile learning and things like that. And I was having a conversation with everyone at the table when I look up and see this, and I take a picture. That I'm like, nobody here is even paying attention to what I'm saying. They're all kind of nodding their heads, but they're not really paying attention to what I'm talking about. And I was like, we've stepped into this realm now where like our attention spans are ever bombarded by things, right? In fact, I think now this research is fairly new, but the average adult human attention is about 8 seconds. So just so you know, the difference, it was about 12 seconds in the 70s. So don't think that like we had this amazing attention span in the 70s pre-technology. It's definitely gotten shorter. And for comparison's sakes, a goldfish has a 9-second attention span. So just so you know, we have less than an attention span than it, which is why I keep clicking things. Squirrel. Okay, hold on a minute there. Sorry, I got distracted. You may notice I'm changing slides quite a bit. I'm asking questions. And it's not just for kids. I mean, you have to think about how do we balance that idea of engagement, especially when we're doing a lot of it remotely, but using technology can help us with that. It can also be disruptive. So we have to make sure that we use it in the right formats. And we'll talk about that in just a second. I'll also point out that one year I decided to dress up as a high school student. And if you've never done this, I would say this is the most telling, amazing professional development you'll ever do in your life. When schools get back in session, dress up as a high school student, dress up as a student at any school and go in and act like a student for a day. Not don't go crazy, but I mean, be a student for the day and just see what you can experience. There's so many amazing things that I uncovered through this day that I've taken back with me. But one of the things I uncovered was that kids were very much, as much as you think kids are just gonna be on their phones all the time, and they were. I mean, sometimes they were getting on them in between classes, but because our classes were so tight and dense in terms of like we had 50 minutes and then like little 6-minute transitions, a lot of the kids used that time to actually socialize, talk, which was great. So I kind of assumed going into this environment, it was kind of like doing my Steve Irwin, like, look, there goes one there with a cell phone, in a terrible Australian accent. But you get the idea that at the same time, I was like trying to experience like what was it like in their natural habitat. And kids told me all the time, I can multitask. They can multitask. One kid told me like, you old people can't. And I said, wait a minute, why am I the old person? But okay. And so I challenged them. And if you're watching along at home, either recording or doing this live, let's try this right now. So what I want you to do is just kind of have both your hands free, if you can. And this is always a great multitasking challenge. Not to pat your head and rub your tummy, that's one, but this is another one to try with kids. And if you can get them to do it, it's pretty impressive if they can do it. But what I want you to do is with one hand, just make a circle in the air. So I'm making a circle in the air with one hand, and then with the other hand, make a square at the same time. You'll notice if you're trying this with me, what's going on? Okay, there we go. Maybe a little better. It's hard to do. And what's funny is, I've talked to kids about this all the time, and they're like, oh, I showed a bunch of high school kids this once, and they came up the next day and like, look, I practiced, and I started thinking, did you go home last night and that was your homework, was to sit there and practice doing that trick? And I said, that's great. I mean, that is definitely something you can teach your brain to do. It's definitely a very low cognitive technique. So the same reason why you could practice patting your head and rubbing your tummy, you train the brain pathways for that muscle memory. I said, but what you can't do as well is do things like drive a motor vehicle and have a conversation via text message on your phone. Like those are two highly cognitive tasks that it's hard to do both of them at the same time. So while kids think they can multitask, they can definitely task switch fairly quickly. And some of us, like I prefer to have like a little bit of light music in the background. It's not necessarily multitasking, but I like to have it whenever I'm creating things. That's not for every kid, not for every a learner too. So you have to think about this. Some kids are multitasking so much that they don't even see kind of a scary object as it approaches them. I don't know how many, this is actually, I think, in Northern California. And I always like to see the point. I don't think you guys can hear it. So if you can hear it, that's great. But basically it's a newspaper, a news crew, not newspaper, a news crew flying over, kind of keeping an eye on this. Now watch for the texter. Wait for the texter. Coming in the alley right here. Oh, a bear. And he runs away. Has the time to put the phone in his pocket, mind you. But again, sometimes we're so focused we don't even see scary objects as they approach us. So, thinking about all of this, thinking about what mobile learning looks like and how we've evolved in terms of communication, it started out, we use body language and voice mostly. And then as we started to have the ability to write, telephones came around in the 19th century. And then you think about emailing, texting, posting, tweeting, all of these other things. It's like, how do we get ourselves to focus and kind of be centered in the now, so to speak? So one of the things that I've worked with some schools about recently is just like, even in a virtual setting, how can you let them be more self-aware, like practice kind of self-awareness meditation? Because, you see photos like this is 21st century tan lines, right? And I would say it's not just teenagers, by the way. These are kids, adults do this too. I see lots of pictures of feet at the beach all the time, especially pre-COVID. But now even people get out there when they can get socially distant from people and take pictures of themselves at the beach. So I think it's important to always have this idea of self-awareness. And so what we're going to do right now is, and I know there's just a few of you with us, and if you're watching this in recording, you can do this as well. But essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a video for about 1 minute. And I just want you to kind of practice kind of focusing as this video starts. I just want you to kind of think about your breathing. So close your eyes for a minute. Don't even look at the screen. Just put your eyes away. And if you want to, you can see it's a little video with some butterflies. And in the background, there's some very light music playing, which you guys can't hear, but there is some light music playing in the background. But I want you to, again, kind of take a deep breath. Breathe in through your nose. And breathe out through your mouth. Do that a couple more times. Don't worry about all the things going around. Just kind of be centered in this moment. Breathe in again through your nose and hold. And breathe out through your mouth. We live in such a fast-paced world, all this connection. We need to make sure that we take time to take a break, to breathe. Breathing in one more time. Hold. And out. I think it's important to do this. And I'll just add that, while this was only a minute, doing this with students can really help them in terms of productivity and focus too. And I think there are a series of videos. Someone actually shared with me a playlist that was a mindfulness playlist that's on YouTube, where they have lots of these videos, by the way. So don't feel like this is just one I found for 1 minute on YouTube. There's lots of them, but they're just light music. And again, depending on the age of the students, having that 1 minute of just kind of calm and breathing can really help them get re-energized and refocused, get their brain recentered around, and kind of peel away all of those extra things and external things that they're thinking about in the back of their mind. Adults, we need to do this too. I think it's important to continue to have a minute or two of your day where you're just kind of taking everything off, turn everything off, and just go and focus and maybe sit and just kind of breathe. And I think just doing that for 1 or 2 minutes is very powerful. So I will add that, again, I've had a teacher friend of mine who did this with her students, one of which was my daughter. who they really struggled with when they came back from recess. It would again back when school was in person, they'd come back from recess and they're running around. And she started doing this virtually too, which was pretty neat. But essentially, she was struggling with them getting recentered and refocused. And so what she did was she started to have them do a minute or two of just light meditation, second grade. And it meant a lot. She said she felt and saw lots of tremendous gains when it came to focus, attentiveness, behavior, and then again, just that productivity element of the afternoon. So if you teach multiple classes, I know that's hard to do, but even just taking that 1 minute sometimes in the middle of class helps. So even like we did right now, I was right in the middle of the presentation. We just stopped and breathed. I think that's a good thing to do too. And then, of course, we think about 21st century learners, and I love Michael Cohen, who is, I think, one of the folks that are doing the tech rabbi is doing one of the talks for this academy. He shared something called the Invisible iPad. It was a blog he wrote several years ago, where essentially, when you think about technology, right now I know it's ever present, but when I walked into classrooms, the most successful classrooms, mobile learning classrooms in my school district, when I walked into the ones that were the most successful, I felt like the technology was almost invisible. And I think when Michael's blog, he references that too, in the sense that it is like a pencil, it's a scissors, it's the air conditioning, it's the electricity, it's just part of the room. It's not we're going to do a tech lesson about technology. It just becomes a vehicle for which you can create. And you don't always have to use it. There's other ways that you can create, but a lot of times it's centered around, again, the idea of this tool. So when we think about mobile learning, this is a quadrant that I wrote this book. This was been 2016 to 2018. I wrote a 6-book series around mobile learning, and this quadrant kind of came up quite a bit in my mind. And so we're going to focus on these 4 parts for the next little 30 minutes of this talk. And that is, when you're thinking about content, how is the content being used by the students? Are they consuming it or creating it? And again, I'm going to say this throughout. There's not a right or wrong of this, but there needs to be a balance or blend of the two. So if you're doing nothing but creating, that's not necessarily great either, but you need to have them consume a little bit. But if you're doing just consuming, then you need to have a little bit more creative action into your classroom. And it's very much age dependent. Who does most of the interaction in your classroom? Is it teacher to student or is it student to student? So again, thinking about that. And again, there's times for both of these. There's times when it needs to be teacher to student. What I'm doing now is very much teacher to student. Student to student would be more when I say, okay, go into the chat and use that, or when we have breakout rooms, things like that. Where does the learning happen in your classroom? And again, this is kind of funny when you think about it, because in a traditional classroom, you're probably thinking right now, well, yeah, this just happens inside the classroom. But now that we've all kind of experienced what virtual is like, it doesn't have to be just inside the classroom. And then also, is there some sort of movement involved, whether it be remote or in person? Are you letting the kids have an opportunity to stand and stretch a little bit? We'll do that in just a minute. And then when can students access the learning in your classroom? This again was one of the challenging ones I always had when I talk about traditional schools, and I think that we've seen this upended quite a bit over the last definitely the last 5 or 6 months, because now the idea is the synchronous or asynchronous. Again, I wrote this a long time ago, and I say a long time ago, it was 3 years ago. It wasn't that long ago, but at the time, how do we bend learning in terms of that time element? Because at the time, it's still just about in class, in desk, seat time. That's when you're learning. Other than that, you're not learning outside of that time. And now we figured out that maybe there's other ways to make that better. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. Let's focus on content first of all. So I don't know how many of you still get the newspaper, but when I was teaching back in the turn of the century with a lot of those first graders I showed you at the beginning, the newspaper was definitely the main news source. It was the way that we got our content. It was somebody witnessed a story, wrote a story, it was edited, it was put into a paper and published the next day, and it landed on your doorstep. So the news cycle was about 12 to 18 hours in terms of some events happening. And what we've seen recently, of course, over the years is that just news is now everywhere and it's ever present, and anybody can write about it. And which, of course, has a whole nother side element of like, how do we teach our kids what is a vetted resource or not? And I think that's important to think about when we think about the content, how it's being created. So we've gone from these vetted sources of content to anybody can create content. And that's good and bad. There's good and bads to both of that, obviously, because if anyone can create it, it doesn't need to be vetted. But there's also kind of this democratization of content. Now you think about the classroom. In the same kind of parallels to what that looks like. So in a classroom setting, of course, the traditional model is this. You have these textbooks here. By the way, yes, we do have a book in Texas called Just Texas Science. Not science, mind you, but Texas Science, because it has its own brand of science. We do things different here. But thinking about, again, these textbooks and how they're invented and how their content is created is very much like the newspaper, right? You have certain people that say, these are the things we're going to write for our students, and it's written, it's edited, it's published, and it sits on your bookshelf for a year, 2 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever. sitting there kind of static versus the idea that, again, it can be, we can all create the content in certain ways, like that democratization of content. There's all these different tools out there, and of course some of you probably use some of them. I mean, it doesn't, I mentioned a couple here from Microsoft, but there's also, like, Apple has the iBooks author, which I think they're starting to kind of, they're changing and tweaking now into something else. They used to have something called iTunes U, which I know is going away, but lots of different ways that you can go out there and create your own content. Or there's OER or CK12 or Coursera that have the free available content for students and schools. So we no longer have to go out and say pay thousands of dollars for these textbooks, because when they went digital, everybody thought, oh, it's going to be so much cheaper. Well, let me tell you something. They still have to pay the bills, right? So those textbook companies, for the most part, are publishers, not programmers. They created these digital versions of their books and sold them at almost the same price. So really, it's not about the textbook, though. It's about the standards that we need to teach our kids, and how do we need to get them to learn and create around those standards. So lots of different ways you can do that. I always call it the game of school, and it's a lot of different ideas when you think about the game of school. But it's the idea that I was walking and talking to some of these seniors. This is a year ago, and they were walking out, and I was telling them, I was like, "Hey, what are some, tell me about some of your favorite classes, and why did everybody take this one particular class from this one teacher? Is it just because she was just this amazing teacher, and, like, she's a great teacher, but the reason why we all took her class," and the kid kind of looked around and made sure no one was paying attention. She's like, "It's because she posts the notes for the quizzes a week before the quiz." And I mean, openly does it, says, "Hey, here are the notes. This is if you read these notes, you'll ace the quiz." And so we all read the notes, aced the quiz, and we all got A's, and that's what we wanted to do. And I said, "Well, did you learn anything?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I learned how to make an A." And I said, "Yeah, that's something wrong there when we think about the game of school and how that's changed and shifted, because it's not just about these assessments." I know that a lot of people are focused on this, but the game of life goes on a lot further than just school and even college. So getting kids to learn, and as much as we have to, as teachers, think about these tools, that's definitely something. We can't just throw these assessments away. We do have to kind of make sure that we instill with them all those soft skills that I showed you earlier, in terms of how do we instill those in our students to make them better people in life in general, and generally more content as well, not just in, here's those soft skills I mentioned from before. So thinking about these, how do these fall into that test? Now, I will say this, looking back at this, there's definitely some skills here. I mean, time management, perseverance. I mean, there's some things that you need to do when it comes to testing too that fall into these soft skills. But for the most part, again, as teachers and educators, we are trying to instill these things in our students as much as we can. And that doesn't necessarily always happen on a test. And there are no tests that I know of right now that test these soft skills, except for when you have them create and do those project-based, those team activities, things that they have to do together. That's when these skills really start to shine. And they aren't necessarily on a test. It may be a rubric, but not a test that you can just take a multiple choice test to see how positive is your attitude or how well do you handle criticism. It has to be done in some sort of practice, and that process needs to be done in as well. It's not just about the product. Again, it's about the process. There's also these books that are out here a lot. You see these test prep books, and I always think this one scares me because it's geared toward a certain audience. I mean, they make these books now for kindergarten kids. Again, we've lost our focus if this is what we're focusing on in education. So when we think about that content, again, there's lots of different ideas and strategies. I'll share with you one quick story, and then how it ties into our modern kind of world here. This was I was in sixth grade, and I was given this recipe homework activity where everybody had to go home and make a recipe about something, and then bring it in and turn it in. And it was supposed to be like, go through the steps of it and show what you learned, essentially. However, I, of course, had this beautiful piece of technology in my house. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to make it a little bit different. Why don't I innovate here, right? Let's be innovative. Or so I thought as a student. And so I did. I made a cooking show, and this is me as a chef, and I was cooking some cookies that I had made several times and just made my own ingredients for. And so, of course, I do this live. This is all recorded. Now, of course, there's no editing back then. So basically, I just had to turn it off and turn it back on again. This microwave, when I turn it on, like the lights flicker. It's pretty bad. And this cookie that I made had basically, it was like eggs and butter and sugar and chocolate. And that was pretty much all it was, and some flour. And then, of course, when I put it in the oven, I forget to wear an oven mitt on my other hand. So I burned my hand right there with my other hand. Not so good. So I make this video, and I'm like, this is it. This is my homework challenge. I'm going to turn this in for my homework. And so someone mentioned in the chat VHS tapes, right? So I break out the VHS tape. We find the one TV in the entire school that has like the VHS player on the cart thing, if you remember that. We wheel it in from the library, and we stick this tape in, and all the kids watch it, and they're all like, wow, and their jaws drop and they clap, and I'm excited. And then I got my grade. And I was floored that I got an F. It was actually the first F I can ever remember getting in academics. I was a straight A student up until this point. Never had ever had a problem with school or teachers or anything, and I thought I was being innovative. And so in the chat, mentioned, why do you think I got an F, by the way, for doing this activity? What do you think the reasoning was? Because it was about the homework was go home, write a recipe, you know, turn it in, go through the steps. How do you make this recipe? How do you make whatever it is that you're doing? And then what did I do that was wrong? Yeah, it wasn't what the teacher wanted. I wasn't actually following directions, right? The teacher specifically said, go home and write. And if I had written like a little recipe card and handed that out as well as the tape, yeah, that lack of compliance, it was like, nope, I asked you for this specifically. It wasn't about, even though technically I was giving the recipe, it just wasn't in the exact format that the teacher wanted. I was doing it in a video format, which at the time, again, pretty different, 1986 or whenever that was. So is that more important, or what is it more important to show and demonstrate your learning and understanding? Because I will tell you that I still to this day memorize that recipe. We did it many times, had many takes. I ate some of the leftovers. You can tell I still kind of hold some of that with me. Um, but how did we show that learning? And I think is that the most important thing. Now I flash forward to modern times, and this was just a few years ago when I was walking through my high school. I'll give a shout out to Natalie Cannon, who's our Latin teacher there at Westlake High School, and she pulls me over and she's like, "This kid Jeff has made this video," and he goes, "I just have to show it to you." And I was like, "Okay, what is it?" And he's like, "Well," she goes, "Well, first let me just tell you, the assignment was go home and I want you to make a PowerPoint about how the Roman bathhouse existed, but I want you to do it and convert the words into Latin. And basically, you're going to do a 2-minute presentation when you get back to class using PowerPoint slides to demonstrate this." And he decided to do something different. So he did this. He basically decided to build an entire world in Minecraft. He built a Roman bathhouse in Minecraft, built it to scale. Um, and you can't hear him, but essentially, as he's driving through this world, he's speaking in Latin as he's saying, "Okay, go left, go right." And again, I don't speak Latin, so it's hard for me to say it. And even the signs have Latin written on them. And just kind of looking at all the various things that are in this Roman bathhouse. And so it was interesting taking a place from history, recreating it in a tool that he was comfortable with, and then turning it in. Again, the idea that he demonstrated his own learning. So when we asked the student, this is a freshman, by the way, at the time. So a few years later, fast forward, and we asked, I was doing some interviews, and saw him, and I said, "Jeff, I use that video all the time. I'm always showing teachers this example." And I go, let me ask you a question. Do you still remember everything about that? And he said, "I remember every single part of that." He goes, "It took me 20 hours to build it. So a lot of time, more than a 2-hour PowerPoint probably, but he remembers the signs. He remembers how he got the kids, how he drove through it, how he wanted to set up his thing. He had to record it several times to memorize it. So he internalized that learning. So again, thinking about that idea of content, where is most of it coming from in your classroom? Are you the one creating it, or are your kids doing it? And I would say largely this shifts throughout the school year. So you start the school year out, it's probably you creating a lot of the content because you're getting the kids to kind of engage as much as you can. But as the school year goes, you can continue to, again, push some of that content creation to them. So it's you saying, here are the things I want. Use a platform or any platform you wish. It doesn't have to be always a PowerPoint slide. It could be lots of different ways to create it to demonstrate that you understand the concept. That's all I care about. And as a teachers, that's what we should be focusing on. Now, one little caveat there. We also shouldn't be giving them like unlimited choice, because if you do that, sometimes it becomes a mess of too much. You can almost have paralysis through choice. So giving them a wide range of menu of items is good. And if a student wants to break out and say, "Hey, I want to try something different, like build my world in Minecraft to show you the Roman bathhouse in Latin," maybe you need to have some flexibility to say, "All right, are you still demonstrating the core goals here, which is your understanding of that ancient, a Roman bathhouse, but also using your words in Latin to demonstrate it?" And I think if that happens, they're still achieving it. That student, by the way, did not get an F; they got an A. So again, demonstrating learning is pretty important. Now let's shift down to this one again. Who's doing most of the interaction in your classroom? Is it teacher to student or student to student? Um, I always like the Vanilla Ice song, right? Stop, collaborate, and listen. I think he was onto something back then, right? We do need to sometimes collaborate. And oh yeah, there we go. In case you don't know what that is, ice, baby. Okay, so when I was a kid, of course, collaboration meant you brought a friend over and an extra remote control in, and that was collaborating. And it's definitely changed quite a bit because now everything's online, so that interaction becomes a little bit different. I like this David Weinberger quote, which said, "The smartest person in the room is the room." I sometimes like to say the smartest person in the world is the world, because now we are all connected. The fact that I'm sitting here talking to you guys, and I see some of you are from Kansas, some of you are from California, from everywhere. We can now connect in different ways, and our students can too. Make that authentic audience that we always want with our students. And I always think about also how do we keep curiosity in the minds of our kids, and some of that happens through those interactions, through that collaboration. Um, this is my daughter when she was 4 years old, and we were walking outside, and there was a blimp flying overhead. And I sit there and I looked at her and I said, "Oh, look at that blimp!" And I went to go take my camera out to take a picture of it. When all of a sudden I looked down and I saw those eyes, and I thought, "Man, look at those eyes! How do we keep that look of interest in her eyes throughout all of high school?" I want her to have that same look all through high school, all through college, just that curiosity of life, right? Except for boys, I don't want her to look at boys that way, but everyone else is okay. As a teacher, I felt like I failed miserably when I got this question. And the reason why is I mean, I think to me, it made me think that, okay, so it doesn't matter what I say. All you care about is what's on the test. It should be more about that learning, right? And if this is all they're focused on in your classroom, then we need to make sure we're pulling them back from this. We need to figure out ways to invent ways to have them fail or do those little challenges that get those soft skills built up. And I like this quote from Seth Godin, which is we need to be asking our kids to solve those interesting problems, which is true. We absolutely do. But I'll take it a step further, and he says we need to be okay if they get them wrong. I think that's also important because not every answer in life is in the back of a textbook. We need to make sure that they are having little opportunities to try things, make mistakes. And right now, guys, of all the times in our life as teachers, this is the time when we see this because we are also trying to learn this remote learning thing quickly. A lot of people have been doing it for a long time, but most teachers that are used to in-person school are not. And so I think it's important to also model that when we talk to our students and be like, hey guys, I'm trying to do this poll and I don't know if it's going to work, but actually having those words and saying to them, I'm trying something new, lets them lean in a little bit more versus you saying, oh, I hate this stupid technology or I can't get this computer to work, those kind of things. And that's a real emotion, but also it says something. Your words are impactful when we talk about our kids and what they're doing and what they're understanding. And it's interesting when it comes to kids, their questioning drops off. This is actually research out of Stanford that shows that around the age of 4, the average age, that's when questioning, like in terms of curiosity-based questioning, it should say there, really drops off. And I think it drops off tremendously because, in this idea, the research shows that reading and writing increase, which means kids can go out and kind of find their own answers. So maybe they're not asking as many questions because they're reading and writing more. But some of it is also in school. We kind of get to beat the curiosity out of them in some ways. And I think Sir Ken, who just passed away a couple of days ago, always talked about that curiosity, how having that passion for learning is so important, and how we kind of beat that out of them as they go through school because we're pushing the academics on them too much. And I think that it doesn't have to be an either or. I think you can build in those academics and still have those curiosity-based questions. This is me with a bunch of kindergartners a couple of years ago, and here we are doing coding in the classroom. These little girls here get their code right. Yay! Again, they're coding in the classroom. There's a kid dragging his headphones across the floor. Again, 5-year-olds, guys, all trying different things. There are 45-year-olds in this room just on top of each other trying to figure out different code. And at 5-year-olds, they're used to it. They can try things, they mess up, they try again. It's almost like a game. I may die, but at least I'm going to try it again. I'll keep playing the game until I get it right. And somehow, again, that kind of dies off a little bit as I get older. Now, this is another group of students that I'm proud of. The one that's holding that little device there is Kevin. He's actually one of my former first graders that I used to teach. And he graduated a couple of years ago, and he's one of these kids that like right off the bat he's just different, right? In a good way. He walked into my classroom as a 6-year-old, and I'm sitting there teaching a computer lab class, and he looks up to me and he goes, Mr. Hooker, how on on Windows they have the little trash can there? I was like, yeah. That's where you get rid of your files and stuff. He goes, yeah. He goes, how do you throw away the trash can? And I said, oh, you just put it in. Oh, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And I was like, just the way his mind works. He's actually developed several apps in the App Store now. These kids go to Stanford, they go to Yale. I'm not worried about them. They're very successful, and they'll be successful at those schools too. I worry more about those struggling C students that kind of fall through the cracks, that don't play the game of school the same way, right? And so a couple different ideas out there. One of them is, creating opportunities for them to have outside of academics, whether it be sports or band, those fine arts, having them shine in other ways because there are lots of talents out there besides just academic talents. And then also, if you're doing something academically, have them do something like this. This is an incubator EDU, which is just it's a curriculum, but there's lots of different ones out there. You don't have to use this one, but essentially you create incubator courses for kids where they go in and they create teams at the beginning of the year, and they figure out ways to solve actual problems in the actual community, and they pitch them to actual investors. Here's a picture of some students pitching to a deck, their slide deck, to some investors who you can see sitting around kind of watching and observing and giving them feedback about what that looks like. Like, okay, here's here's what we're thinking, here's the challenge, and here's how we need you to save, here's how we need your investment to help us with this problem. Think about Shark Tank kind of on that level, right? So again, these aren't for the straight A kids. These are just the kids that were more like, we just want to figure out ways to build and create. And maybe, those kids that drop out of school sometimes and build computers in their garages, like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, having those opportunities for kids not to drop out of school to say, hey, here's an opportunity for you to build and create inside our classroom is also powerful. So again, and a lot of it has to do with that collaboration, that student to student interaction. So again, just a question to ponder in the back of your own mind. Think about how often you encourage student interaction. Are you allowing it a lot? It's definitely different in a remote setting. You have to figure out inventive ways of using things like Trello boards and collaborative documents to have them on there to actually connect and collaborate, and setting up their own chats or their own Teams chats or video chats, where they can do that. But there is opportunity for this even in a remote setting, because there are businesses across this planet that have been doing this for a decade in terms of connecting with each other and having projects done together, even when they're not in the same physical building. So there's definitely a way to do it. It's just different. Again, it's different than our way of thinking of school. And then the last couple here. Where does learning happen in your classroom? Is it static or dynamic? And again, I'll tie back into some old media here. This beautiful piece of technology here, this radio was amazing, but the beautiful piece of furniture, great sound, but it was completely usurped in the 1950s by this piece of technology. This little pocket-sized transistor that had absolutely awful sound, but every single teenager in the world wanted it. And why did they want it? Well, if you think about the device on the left, this was the family's radio. You would all gather around the radio and turn on the channel and listen to the same songs and all of that, versus the device on the right, where all of a sudden, as a student, you had choice, you had opportunity, you had the idea that I could go around and actually, change the channel. This happened in the 1950s. Something else, coincidentally, that happened in the 1950s, by the way, was rock and roll. And I think a lot of that wouldn't have happened if we had been sitting around listening to our parents' radio the whole time. They wouldn't allow us to listen to it. So having that a little ability to kind of move around, and we see it today too, right? Now we're mobile. We're all over the place looking for Pokemon or whatever, but the idea again that we can actually take learning with us is pretty different. And I'll bring back again the Student for a Day challenge, because it did highlight one other thing that I noticed. Besides the fact that the kids were connected, but they were also socializing in between classes, I noticed how uncomfortable these desks were, and how often, I had to go from class to class, we were forced to sit in them. And I'm thinking, why do we still kind of adhere to that environment? A lot of it's a custodial environment. And Sir Ken talks about it in his talks too, about how, we have to have these rows, kind of the military mindset, the factory mindset of having kids in rows, but also the custodial element of it is custodians, it's easier to clean when the desks are in rows, because they can just kind of sweep their broom in between. So again, why do we have our classroom set up this way? And it's all focused on the front of the classroom. We should be able to adapt that. Also, having kids just sit this long is not a good thing, especially in these uncomfortable, what I call torture devices, which it caused me to write an actual blog at one point, because I was like, these things need to go. They need to die. We need to have a tombstone, and we just need to get rid of them right away, which is interesting when you think about it, because the kids don't really complain about it that much. But there are certain students that this isn't right for them. And there are kids where it is, and that's okay. But we have to have some sort of level of flexibility in there. I do think that right before this all happened, there was a movement that was happening over the last several years for flexible classroom furniture and flexible environments. Flexible means not that everyone has a standing desk, because that's not flexible, that's uniform. Flexible means that you have opportunity to choose different ways to sit or engage or stand in a classroom if you want to engage. So you have opportunities to stand, sit. Some people have like the little bouncy balls, or like the yoga balls you can kind of sit on and balance. And a lot of that helps engage the learner, because now they have a little bit of ownership of what they're doing in the classroom and also where they're sitting. And also when you think about just the idea of the brain itself, right? And the brain, how active it is after you sit quietly for a few minutes versus if you actually stand up and stretch. I show this graphic, I think, on every single talk I give, because it is important. And I think it's important for adults too, to remember to stand and stretch. So right now, if you're sitting there watching this, stand up for a minute. I'm going to stand up. You may see me a little bit here. Stand up a little, turn my camera on. There we go. All right, I'm standing up, stretching just a little bit. It's just smart to kind of get up and get that blood flowing too, because if you're sitting in a chair for too long, you'll also feel kind of stagnant also in what you're thinking. So I'm just kind of stretching side to side, stretch those legs out, stretch out those arms, take a deep breath. And even just doing that for a few minutes, or even just a few seconds, it reactivates the brain. I'll get my headphones caught there. And so in doing this virtually or remotely, having opportunities for your students to stand and stretch, take a break. Obviously, we're doing this quickly today because I'm getting through quite a bit of content, is an important thing as well. So having that time to do that is important. And in a classroom setting, of course, it can look different ways. This was me doing using Nearpod on iPads. But essentially, the idea is, taking a virtual field trip. By the way, I didn't tell these kids to stand up. They just started doing it naturally. That kid over there is spinning around. I just noticed, and they're all looking everywhere because they're taking this virtual field trip. And then when I push out the question that's just a question to their devices, they all kind of naturally go back to their seats. Again, I never told them to stand or sit. It's just those little opportunities in class. And of course, this kid here is like, whoa, check this out. Having those opportunities in class to keep those kids kind of up and moving, even subtly like that, makes a huge difference. So again, we think about movement. How much of this are you incorporating into your classroom, whether it be in person or remote, having opportunities for a little bit of movement? Because if you're standing right now while you're watching me, you're probably feeling a little bit better than just sitting the entire time. And then lastly, we'll get to this last bit, and this is the tricky one. We got a few minutes, so time, of course, is of the essence. It's appropriate that we're talking about this. When are the students actually learning in your classroom? Now more than ever, we finally, I think, have kind of handled some of this. But I think about this too. You can go into the chat and mention this too. When do you learn and create best? Are you a morning person when it comes to learning and creating? Are you an afternoon person? Or are you an evening person? So drop that into the chat. I want to see what kind of the folks who are watching this think about when are you learning best? And it's different for every single person. So maybe some of you are morning, some of you are afternoon, some of you, it depends kind of what you're doing. But I'd be kind of curious to see what you guys put in the chat there. Yep, evening there. Yashi, that's very specific, between 4 and 6 a.m. Wow, so you're very much an early morning person. So this is good. This is good for you. You're still in morning your time zone, so you're hopefully still engaged and working on looking at this and thinking of things. Jason, on the other hand, is probably like, wow, it's too early. What am I doing up, or 10 a.m. my time, right? Still going through this. It does depend, right? I think for me, I kind of have a sweet spot as well. It's like it's later morning. So and it depends. Again, and there's times when I do, though, Jason, just like you said yours is evening usually. There's times when I feel like when the kids are asleep, I can knock out some really good content here. But usually by then we're so exhausted too that it's just hard to kind of engage in any type of creative pursuits at all. And again, thinking about timing, back in the 50s, again, they had this beautiful box that would sit there and you could, I like the kid who's like basically right on top of the box in this picture, getting blind from the TV. But, we think about this device too, whenever it came to content and timing, you basically had this guide where you had to go through, and if you wanted to watch Little House on the Prairie on Wednesday, you better be in front of your TV at 7 o'clock. Otherwise, you're going to miss it. There was no magical device that would allow you to do any, you just watch it. There were no reruns. There's no on demand, none of that stuff, no TV land. And it's interesting because I think about, this is a picture of my grandmother and myself and my sister. And she was one of the very creative people one of the most creative people I've ever met, because she did something ahead of her time. She actually invented, I'll move this picture over. She invented picture-in-picture television right there. She had 2 televisions, and then someone, I think Jason mentioned Beta. Up on top of that thing, she had a Betamax. And I was like, Grandma, why do you have 2 TVs? And they both work, by the way. It's because she wanted to watch 2 soap operas at the same time. And so what did she do? She turned on both of them. She recorded one with the sound off and then watched the other one, and then she could watch the other one later. She basically invented Blockbuster. She's brilliant. But when I think about all these things now, and like everything is so much on demand, I didn't even list the #1 video service in the world, and it is by far YouTube, which of course now you can take all of these things, bundle them all up, and stick them right on this device. And all of a sudden your content becomes mobile, which means that your when also becomes mobile. When you're using the content can be not just in the classroom, it can be any time because it's on demand. I'm going to skip this because I want to make sure we have enough time to get to the end here. But again, looking at this and then looking at the schedule of that day that I was a student for a day, I mean, this is, again, what that classroom looked like. It was 50 minutes with 6 minutes in between, lots of different, just cramming content in. But if I'm a student who doesn't learn chemistry well, like in the morning, like if I'm Jason, who's like, I'm an evening person, and especially with science, then I've just missed the boat if I have to take this class at 9:30 in the morning, because my brain's just not there yet with it. So what's nice now is that we have this opportunity, I would say, for synchronous and asynchronous learning, that we can put a lot of that on demand, online, blend it, put it into a LMS, put it into some sort of platform where kids can actually interact with it at different times throughout the day in an asynchronous way to get their projects done and still learn. I think that's an important thing to think about. And we see asynchronous versus synchronous. Of course, synchronous students all being on time, exactly the same time. I don't care who you are, what you're doing. You have to be in this room for this amount block of time. Versus that idea that you can be engaged in activities at any time. So some kids are the early birds. Some kids like to do it later in the day. Some kids take a little bit longer. Some kids are a little bit shorter. Um, and then Jason adds, he's finding it strange as 12-year-old twins are into old TV shows. Yeah, that's true. So what do we do with students whose district require them to be in class? Yeah, and I think that's a great question. So one of the opportunities you could have during this, especially, so there are times where it's still the class schedule. By the way, we haven't cracked the code on this. I just think we're close now that this is happening. I think that the idea is that in your own classroom, there are certain things you can control. You have to make sure the kids are learning their content, learning their standards. You have to help the kids, and if you can, do all those soft skills as well. But you can control a little bit of that timing. If they're in your classroom and let's just say they're just not a kid that learns well in the morning, there are still ways you can say, okay, I'm going to, instead of just doing this all kind of lecture based, I'm going to make it a little more collaborative. Or you could even say, like, I'm going to give you some of this stuff right now, but I've also recorded, a 5 minute screencastify of something that I've done, that basically the lecture of what I just gave you, some of the overview of it. So tonight when you go home, or that idea of the flipped classroom, which you probably heard before, now I can put it on these platforms and you can just access it. Of course, YouTube, which is of course one of the other bigger platforms out there when you think about learning, put it on your own YouTube channel and have the students kind of watch it then. So it's not necessarily wasted time in the classroom, because there's still opportunities in there to make those like kind of more like office hours, I would say. So if you have kids that are struggling, they aren't receiving the content at 9 in the morning. That's a terrible time for you to just be shoving out all the most important stuff. And like, if they miss it, they miss it. So putting it in other places for them allows you to have some flexibility too as a teacher. And you don't hopefully have to replicate everything about yourself and your learning. You don't have to be two teachers at once. I mean, in a perfect world, you've kind of pre-recorded some of this, or you can record it while you're in the classroom. Yeah, the flipped classroom has been an idea for a long time. And this concept isn't that you put the desks upside down. It's that, for those students, like you're mentioning, Jason, that struggle with those time periods, how do we say, okay, now I'm going to push the lecture learning part of it later. You can do it on your own time. And that could even be, in some cases, in the classroom. But when you come into the classroom, we're going to spend a lot of our time devoted to actually working, collaborating, working on some of the projects and ideas that we have. We're not doing assessments, obviously, because those are different. So it just becomes an idea. It's just practice is the big thing. I have seen this with the high school teachers, especially, that have tried this, where they've struggled is it doesn't happen right away. It's not like a fire lights on all these kids, and some of them don't go and watch the videos, and you have to make sure that using tools like Edpuzzle or Nearpod that have the little video embedded things where you can have them check and see if they're engaged in them. I think that's important too. And then just being consistent and saying, I am checking to see if you're watching the videos, and if you're not, we'll know right away, because just doing some quick checks. So even starting out the first week doing some of these where you put some things online, and then when they come to in-person class or remote, asking them those questions during that synchronous time to check for understandings about whether they do it. Yeah, and I've seen that too, Jason. Parents have said, "Well, you're just recording a video and you're not teaching them." And so I think that my response to that would be like, "Yeah, I guess you as a parent have never used YouTube to learn anything, or you as a parent have never actually." I wouldn't actually say that to a parent, but in that sense, you could say like, "Yes, this is one of the tools that I'm using to teach your kid. This is not the only tool that I'm using to teach your kid." And what I'm doing is allowing your kid to have some flexibility in terms of their learning styles, while still allowing for those students that need the traditional learning method of being in class as well. So what you're doing is if anything, you're actually being more of a teacher by doing this recorded method of it too. Now, if the only thing you do is say, here's a video, good luck, then they have something to stand on there. But if you talk about the other things, the follow-up tools, the way you're having them collaborate on projects, the way you're using it as a resource for them to kind of reteach and relearn, I think that's an important thing as well. So I'll end really quick because I think we're out of time here. And I'll just share this story real quickly with you. And that is, and now I hear my phone ringing. That's like my alarm to tell me that we're done. I talked a lot about this, a lot about communication and how it's kind of changed everything. And I mentioned this lady at the beginning of the talk, and I'll bring her up just because I think it's important kind of to think about her life too, but how we affect what we do and how we react, how it affects everyone around us. And in her case, after this picture was taken about 2 weeks after this, she had actually fallen down and broke her hip, broke her wrist, and broke her ribs, and was in the hospital. And it was one of those deals where we just knew that she probably wasn't going to make it out of the hospital. She was there, and she was 82 at the time, and so I went and visited her, and in this hospital, and we sat and talked for hours and hours and several nights. And one of the last times I ever visited her, actually turned out to be the last time I visited her. I came by and I said, what are some regrets, Gloria? What are some regrets you have in life? And she told me all the stories about, she had, she was engaged 3 times, which I didn't know. She was the single aunt that has all the cats. You know that aunt. You guys have those people in your family. Um, and all these amazing things that she'd done in her life. But she said one of the things that she'd always wanted to do that she never got to do was travel to Machu Picchu. And I said, you know what? I looked over at my backpack and I said, you know what? We're going to go there right now. And she's like, no, there's no way I'm leaving this hospital room. I said, no, we're going to figure it out. Watch this. And so I did. I took out a device. I took out a laptop and I said, here it is. Watch. And I pushed out on Nearpod. I pushed out the virtual thing, the same thing you saw those students looking at in first grade. And she's holding up the thing and just kind of looking around and just like, wow, this is amazing. And she was able to kind of see all these different worlds and she said, where else can we go? And I was like, well, we want to go to Mars. Sure, let's go to Mars. And so we went to Mars, and then we went to we went to the pyramids, and we sat there for about 3 hours just looking at all these different places. And I started thinking, yeah, there's so many things out there that we need to be, the opportunities we have. And when I left the hospital that day, I didn't realize it was the last time I'd see her. She passed away about a week later. But I think about us as teachers. We're teachers not only of our own students, but of our families, of our friends. And I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this lately, where you're also a teacher of your own kids in your house. So, it expands beyond our profession in a lot of ways. And I think that's important to think about, taking those risks and trying those things to help bring some sort of mobile collaboration into our classrooms. And I know that there's going to be there is parent pushback. And what Jason says, I don't want to dismiss it. There is definitely parent pushback about a lot of this. And in fact, one of the things I didn't share was that there is an interesting example of a teacher who's taken this to the next level, and I absolutely love this example of mobile learning. And she's a U.S. history teacher. Her name is Kathy Cluck, and today, I think this week, she started teaching class here in Austin, and she is deciding that instead of teaching just from her house to their houses, that she got a little van, she's got a little hotspot, and she's going to drive to all the historical places in the United States that she can get to, and basically teach class from those historical places. She's like, what an opportunity to truly be mobile and go out there and go to Jamestown and actually be like, all right, class, today I'm coming to you live from Jamestown. And I think, God, what an amazing opportunity. Not everyone has that opportunity and option. Obviously, a lot of us have kids and other responsibilities, but the fact that she's doing that and seeing this an opportunity to be more mobile and actually to get that, to really pull those kids into a different idea versus, I would love to go to Machu Picchu, but obviously having virtual ability to do that is just pretty cool. So I share that idea again with this last idea, which is, when does learning take place in and out of your school? And if it's just happening just in your classroom, think about some different ways where you can give kids those opportunities, those extensions at home. That's not just homework, but actually rewatching, redoing some of the things that maybe you've done in class earlier in that day, or having them collaborate asynchronously on a project. Again, just to add in all those functions and those different ideas of mobile learning. So again, content. How are they consuming it? How are they creating it? Interaction. Is it student to student, teacher to student? Where are they learning it? Are they moving around when they're doing it? And then when are they learning it? Again, synchronous versus asynchronous, all things to consider. And I always think there's a lot of risk when you're trying something new. And I think this is the opportunity more than ever for us as teachers to try things that are a little bit different, not necessarily saying that it's going to work perfectly the first time, but actually saying, I'm going to try this for the betterment of learning of our kids. And I always say this too, that students don't take risks if teachers don't take risks. They watch and model what you do. Teachers, on the same side, you won't take a risk if your leaders aren't also doing those same things. So you have to have that support in order to do some of the new things that you're going to try in your classroom this year and going forward. So thank you all so much. That was Mobile Learning Mindset in a little bit over an hour and 10 minutes. So thank you guys for hanging out there in the chat. Good job interacting, and appreciate it, and hope you guys have a great day. And I'm going to turn off the recording right now.